If you could deliver one message for future generations of LGBTQ advocates and allies, what would it be about sustaining the movement and protecting each other?
I would say protect your joy as fiercely as you can. Protect one another within the LGBTQ community, because like I said, in the past, there's been division. Trans folks have felt ostracized for most of, the liberation fight. We've got to be strategic. We've got to come together. We've got to be collective, and we have to build a critical mass of folks, of people, and the intersections that are separating us out need to come together.
Welcome to Rooted in Our Ancestors' Dreams, the podcast where we explore the wisdom, resilience, and dreams of those who came before us and how their legacy shapes our present and future. I'm Cara, and each week we'll dive into stories, traditions, and conversations that reconnect us with our roots, honor our ancestors, and help us plant seeds for a brighter tomorrow. This podcast is about more than storytelling. It's about reclaiming our narratives, reflecting on our journey, and rooting ourselves in the dreams that carried our people forward. So grab your tea, your journal, or just a moment of quiet as we take this journey together. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Melissa McCollister. She is an assistant professor of social work at Minnesota State University with approximately 15 years of prior experience at the University of Akron. She's been a social justice activist for the LGBTQIA+ community for over 25 years. Back in 2002, she co-funded the first LGBTQIA+ youth program as the Akron Pride Collective alongside her colleague, Leah Davis, creating a space where young people could find belonging, affirmation, and community support. Later, she served as the executive director for the Pride Center of Terre Haute, the first ever Pride Center established in that city, helping to build this foundation and expand resources for LGBTQIA+ individuals in a conservative region. Welcome, Melissa. To start with, can you tell us, what does Rooted in Our Ancestors' Dreams mean to you?
Yes, thank you, Cara. Thanks for having me. I was very excited when I saw your logo and heard about what you're doing. And, for me, being rooted in my ancestors' dreams, I think of my family. I come from a long line of ministers in my family. Both sides of my mother's family were ministers. And to me, being rooted in my ancestors' dream, it's grounding me like in the values and the tradition, the wisdom that was passed down to me by my grandparents, and really remembering where you came from and honoring those that came before you. I always ask God to place me where I'm needed to do his work. And I'm always thinking of my grandparents when I ask that, because they nourished me. They built who I am in the soil of their sacrifices and their resiliency. I come from a very blue collar family that worked in the factories of, Northeast Ohio. I think about, what it meant for them to survive and what it meant to, fight for equity, fight for, a better world. And so it's a big reason I became a social worker, because I believe that social work is grounded in, a higher purpose, a higher power. And so it closely aligns with my ancestors.
Thank you so much for that. Building on your background and looking at all of the things you've done to advance the rights and equity for LGBTQIA population, how do politics and policy shape the daily lived experiences of LGBTQIA+ individuals, especially with those intersecting marginalized identities?
So as you mentioned earlier, I've been doing this work for about 25 years. And, I'm 50 years old today, and I felt safer when I came out at 20 in the early 90s than I do today because of politics and policy. They dictate our access to healthcare, education, housing, safety, all the things that are going on right now with the anti-DEI legislation not only hit, our profession of social work, but specifically are targeting the LGBTQ community, the bans on gender affirming care and the book restrictions. And this is nothing new either. However, specifically targeting trans individuals reminds me of the 1930s. Not very many people know, but Magnus Hirschfeld was a researcher in the Sexology Institute in Germany. And the very first place that the Nazis targeted was this institute, and burning of 20,000 books, all on LGBTQ folks, specifically on a third gender, which was trans identity. And it feels full circle. It's like coming around again that, these policies are directly impacting the LGBTQ community. And then where the intersections come, Black, Indigenous, disabled, low-income folks, trans women of color are at the highest risk for hate crimes. And I'm not just, targeting or saying, Black trans women of color within our LGBTQ communities, but just overall, Black, Indigenous, disabled, low-income folks are targeted with all of the different policies. Those with the least access to power typically are the ones who are impacted first, and then the intersection of being within the LGBTQ community. Those that are white, privileged, that have more access, don't have the same level of impact that these policies are, affecting. And I experienced this firsthand. I was living in Iowa, and they became the first state in the nation to remove civil rights protections for gender identity. And I do identify as a non-binary person. I use the pronouns she and they. I think about, I am also a person who identifies as white, and I feel that I have a lot of privilege. And I left Iowa. I left because I felt that, the state was a Republican trifecta. The governor had control and was able to pass these horrible policies. But with my privilege, I was able to leave. Well, not everybody is able to do that, especially at these intersections. And so we have to continuously center those within, the LGBTQ community that have the least access to power. And, as a social worker, I try to conduct power analyses and show my students how to do that as well. And so that intersectionality doesn't become a theory, but it's more of an ethical practice in which we, we come together and we advocate for. But this is very difficult because the term personal is political. I felt that I had to get out of Iowa because I also was discriminated against by neighbors for holding a gay flag. I was working in institutions that were religious-based and was harassed. And when I was in Indiana, I was threatened by KKK with access on my doorstep. And this had hit me so hard when the policies changed in Iowa. But even at that, I had the privilege to leave. And so they shape the daily policies, and politics shape the daily lives, because most people who are at the intersection can't just up and leave. They can't protect themselves in the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. I am so sorry you had to go through that.
Yeah.
That does sound like quite a bit, that politics does kind of affect not only, on the higher level, but also on the micro level, the day-to-day interactions that you have with neighbors, coworkers and such.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of layers of the LGBTQ population, just like there is with any other culture. So how have race, class, gender, and sexuality historically intersected in the fight for rights and recognition for LGBTQ?
Well, in 1969, the Stonewall Uprising is what comes to mind. A lot of people don't know that the Stonewall Uprising was led by two trans women of color, Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Riviera, and these women stood on the front lines of resistance and police brutality, and they led the movement. They led the gay liberation movement. But even within the LGBTQ community, their voices were silenced for decades. I remember when I first came out, even the term LGBTQ it started with a G. It was G, LGBT, for gay men. And they recognized that, gay men, specifically white men, were very privileged. Even though, HIV and AIDS hit the population really, hard in the 80s, there is this power, and access to power. And if you look economically, gay men tend to have higher incomes. So, even in the history of the LGBTQ movement, there is, marginalization and discrimination because, in Stonewall, it wasn't just about like what we see today with pride, parades and events. Like it was a riot. Like people were fighting for survival and fighting for rights, and they risked literally everything. And it is a convergence of all these identities, and strands of the LGBTQ community kind of like coming together. But throughout history, just like any other civil rights group, within those groups, there is a caste system, unfortunately. And I think it has something to do with, the society that we live in. We live in a capitalistic society, a hierarchical society. And so within our marginalized populations, there's also hierarchy. And so, when it's narrowed, when LGBTQ advocacy is narrowed to only focus on privilege, whiteness, wealth, we leave out those who are most in need for access. And so I have always taught students to center the voices of those who are most proximate to the issues, those who have the least access to power. Like you might be part of a marginalized group, but look at your privilege, use cultural humility, and assess, whose voices need to be elevated.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thinking of, the civil rights movement and, Stonewall, I think a lot of people forget that, even though Martin Luther King Jr. was the face of the civil rights movement, the person who actually started it was a gay man. And that was Baynard Rustin.
Rustin, yes.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people forget that when they're thinking about civil rights is not just for people of color. It's for everyone to have rights.
Yes.
Yeah. So how do you mention that you have a lot of religious people in your family, such as pastors, or how do you describe them? Pastors, reverends, deacons?
Yep. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How do faith, family, and cultural background influence one's experience of queerness and self-acceptance?
I think that faith and family can both be affirming and harmful. So the journey for me was really hard towards like self-acceptance. There was this tension between my faith, wanting to belong, and then my authenticity, like wanting to be myself and wanting to come out. And unfortunately, church was just not a place that I felt comfortable in. I was raised in United Church of Christ, and I'm not saying that the church that I went to was, harmful or anything like that, but there were folks within that church that said harmful things about LGBTQ people. And so it was extraordinarily difficult for me. I experienced internalized homophobia early. I would literally pray, please, I don't want to be gay. I want, like live, I don't want to say a normal life, but at the time I was just like, I just want to get married and have kids. And, I don't want to be dealing with this. Those years of my life were horrible, fear, shame. I dated an individual whose family literally put her through conversion therapy. And just the harm and also the stigma around people discriminating, not only your sexual orientation, gender identity, but just not understanding that so many of us are also religious and, having this stigma that, oh, we are, sinning and therefore we're going against God and therefore we don't love God and we don't, this was just so not true. And where I found my spiritual home was the Unitarian Universalists, actually in Akron, Ohio. It's the first place that I went, and then later West Shore in Cleveland in my early 20s. And this really brought me home into my spiritual faith because UUs are ones that honor all faiths. And I felt like this, it helped me to build the foundation of who I am today. It is the strongest part of who I am today. Like, my faith is stronger now than it's ever been. And it's because of the people, the people that I congregate with that, have a love and acceptance for me. I would say that your family and those around you, those close to you, that know you in these intimate ways, when you ostracize this person in your life because of belonging to the LGBTQ community, it is detrimental. Like, it is just deep pain and shame. And so when I was able to find community, it changed everything for me. And I was able to bring back those teachings of what I learned as a kid and from my family in a completely profound and different way.
Absolutely. It sounds like you went through a very tough time growing up and through that acceptance period of your life. And I'm sure a lot of people do. I do get a lot of clients in my own practice that are identify as LGBTQ, and they have such a hard time coming out because of other factors such as religion and culture and the acceptance part. But what role do you think mental health plays in navigating identity within systems that continue to marginalize LGBTQ communities?
It's huge. It's a huge role because so many of us, from being just simply ostracized from our families, churches, schools, employment, there is trauma, right? And so the chronic stress and trauma exposure creates mental health challenges. I experience anxiety, depression. I have PTSD from being threatened, like literally by the KKK with X's on my doorstep, which I was so profoundly taken aback by because I reached out to the police and the police were like, oh, that's probably just prank kids. I wouldn't worry about it. Well, that level of disregard, has created this hypervigilance in me, to where I just don't trust folks. And I don't feel comfortable in where I live and putting a flag out, even though I still do. I put little markers, and I do it because I want other people to know that this is a safe place. So, going back to the question about, mental health, I have been in counseling pretty much my entire adult life. And so much of it is talking about the non-acceptance, and where these traumas end up occurring. It's not because of who we are, and it's about the lack of acceptance of others. It is the harmful policies. It is hearing that, a child committed suicide because they were bullied. It is, just the relentless attacks on the LGBTQ community every single day. This takes a toll on mental health, and it's what we call minority stress, and it's also like a collective trauma. And healing requires more than therapy. What it requires is that there is a community of care, that there are spaces that are affirming, that these spaces are also trauma informed and involve a what's called a liberation centered approach. And what that means is it ends up restoring agency to the people and belonging, so that we are cultivating the networks of safety. Because, unfortunately, in the social work profession, what we see is a lot of performative action. And it is, people will post on their Facebook or they'll show up to pride parades. And, that is something that has bothered me over the last several years is, these pride parades are huge and there's so many people, but where are those people when we're fighting for rights at the State House? Where are those same people that it's not about, dressing up in rainbow suits and because the fight for our lives is deeper and it requires more than optics. We need folks that are willing to stand in solidarity with us, because our mental health is deteriorating on a daily basis. So it's going to take more than just therapy. It's going to take community care.
Absolutely. I think that, when we talk about trauma informed and we look at, affirming care, I think it starts at not just the professional level of treatment, like doctors and therapists, but also at home, in schools, in policies. I think we need to do a little bit more, because even like as we, vote and we put people in office and make these non-affirming kind of laws and things, I think we need to think at the lower level. Because in order to put that person at a higher level, it starts at the bottom. So we need to start looking at who we're voting for on a more local stage.
Oh, I 100% agree. All politics is local. It starts local.
Yeah. What do you think policymakers, educators, and therapists can do to create a safer, more affirming environment for LGBTQ people?
Well, policy, as you said, we need folks voted in on the local level. And they must go beyond just like these symbolic gestures. There needs to be more enforcing of accountability measures and ensuring that when people discriminate, like there is a real consequence. Like I said, I was in Iowa and it was the first state to remove civil rights protection for a protected class. And they also removed like 80 some offices of civil rights within cities. And,
Wow.
Yes, it is absolutely just mind blowing how they were able to do this. But you can do a lot when you have a trifecta of one party. But people need to be aware at the local level of these things that are happening that, are removing people's rights of accountability when discrimination and things like this occur. For educators, their role is crucial because they shape the cultural climate. They shape, the way people have access to knowledge. They shape their curriculum. They can challenge it, assumptions and stuff through their teaching. I know, like, as an educator, there's so much that goes on in my classroom, and I have to intervene when harmful things are said. And, these affirming environments, they're just not built on words. Like, there has to be some kind of action that backs it up, and a daily modeling, right? Like, so people have a reference, that you are doing exactly what you say you're going to do. You walk the talk kind of thing. For therapists, they've got to practice affirming care and address collective as well as systemic trauma, focusing just on the individual and trying to help the individual to navigate systems within their lives is just not enough, because the problems really are systemic. And we have to know these intersections of identity, power, oppression, how that leads to where this individual is at. And so I feel like therapists, mental health professionals need to be more into advocating policy. And at the same time, you know, just making these statements goes back to that performative allyship, and it's dangerous for us, to have an individual to claim to be supportive, and then, when we need to speak out, when we need, a critical mass of folks that are helping to dismantle, unjust policies, where people aren't there. And, I feel like educators, therapists, those that are in the profession need to come out into the macro world and stand in solidarity more. So, and it's not to say that coming to, joyful events, prideful events, it is, not important, because it absolutely is, because LGBTQ people need to feel joy. They need to celebrate. They need to feel, celebration is resilience, right? Celebration is an act of social justice. But daily life is not a pride parade. It's not a pride event. And we need folks to stand in solidarity not just when it's easy, but when it's urgently necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. And, we talked about allyship. What does that look like? Because to me, I consider myself an ally to the LGBTQ community. But what does it mean? Because I think sometimes I look at like TV, can't remember what it was. I think it was like The Real Housewives. One of them, I think, made a comment regarding the gays as if they're like a purse or something, like something that you just carry along. But I wonder if they actually understood how offensive that was.
Very, yeah. For me, an ally is just somebody who shows up consistently, like they're there and they share their power. They use their privilege to help dismantle unjust systems. So it's not just expressing empathy or being compassionate or sending money, right? Like being a savior. We don't need that. What we need are people willing to show up consistently, share their power, share their privilege, convert their awareness into a concrete step. That's the difference. It's redistributing of the resources and amplifying our voices. Because that's the only way that you're able to flip the tables. And like I said, I identify as a white person. Yes, I'm non-binary. Yes, I'm part of the LGBTQ community. Yes, I have disabilities and, and I have, trauma and all of these other things, but I do have power. I have access to power. And within my own LGBTQ community, I center trans women of color. That's who I center, because they are the most at risk and need of access to help. And so when there are chances when I can stand in solidarity and fight, that's what I do. So it's not just for, folks that are, not part of a marginalized community. It's for folks that are inside the marginalized community and also have more privilege and power.
Yeah, I think sometimes we forget, even though like I'm a cisgender Black woman, I'm very cognizant that, the spring bowl that we have that represents the LGBTQ community and these civil rights and these laws and politics, they affect all of us. They're so interconnected, and it's kind of like that old poem, when they came to take this person, that person, the only person that was left was me.
Yeah.
We have to stop it now before it gets out of hand, because it feels like it's being rolled back to Jim Crow.
Gosh, yes.
Kind of like the Holocaust is just rolling back so many policies that affect all of us. and we have to fight. So when you see one group affected, trust me, it's going to roll back into another group.
Exactly.
It hits us all. Even when you think of reproductive rights and things like that, I look and I see that there's a lot of older white men making these laws regarding reproductive rights, and they don't represent me.
Right.
So who's standing on the front line representing us being minorities or part of the marginalized community? Who's representing us? Where are our voices so that we can have some say-so in these policies?
Right. I think of Matthew 25:40. I believe it's the least of us. I can't remember exactly how it goes, but basically how we treat those that have the least access to power, is part of what Jesus is talking about here. Like you need to center those who are, getting hit the hardest in this fight, and realize that your liberation is tied up with theirs. You are not protected. And the further and farther that you run from this, it's going to catch up. It's going to hit you. And people haven't come to that realization yet, although all of our history is wrapped up in it. Every single liberation movement that has been led, right? We see the same thing happening over and over and over. And, what is it going to take for people to realize that what happens to one is going to happen to all? It's going to happen to all of us. Like there is no hiding from this, because we have, less than 1% of the population with all the wealth, all the money, and all the access, making all the rules for all the rest of us. And, this is what I've been doing for most of my life, and trying to figure out how can we build a critical mass? How can we get folks to come together and realize that we're a collective in this fight?
Yeah. If you could deliver one message for future generations of LGBTQ advocates and allies, what would it be about sustaining the movement and protecting each other?
I would say protect your joy as fiercely as you can. Protect one another within the LGBTQ community, because like I said, in the past, there's been division. Trans folks have felt ostracized from most of, the liberation fight since 1969. We've got to be strategic. We've got to come together. We've got to be collective, and we have to build a critical mass of folks, of people, and the intersections that are separating us out need to come together. And so I would say, just showing up at places where you may not have gone before, and stand in solidarity. Join the fight within the LGBTQ community. So for those of you that are, part of the LGBTQ community, join the fight with those who have the least access to power. And if you're, not part of the LGBTQ community, do more than, coming and celebrating, but come and stand when it's hard, when we're in need of, policies to be changed and people to be held accountable.
Absolutely. And I think we also, some things that may not seem big but are helpful is also using like the terminology, making access to resources, just going out of your way to actually advocate for someone. Right. So, is there any agency or organization that you want our listeners to be aware of, that they can donate to, that they can lend their power or their access to?
Right now, Human Rights Campaign is doing a lot to fight, the ACLU as well. But the Human Rights Campaign is one of the largest for LGBTQ population in trying to fight for policy. But every single state has their own LGBTQ network. I know, like here in Minnesota, we have specific like groups that, talk to the governor. Whatever state you're in, find out what those legislative committees are and help support the legislation that they're trying to advocate. If you're a social worker, the NESW chapter within your state is going to have some kind of legislative agenda, and almost every single state right now, specifically here in the Midwest, is protecting trans children. Because the policies that are out there right now are just completely targeting trans youth. And, the harmful effects that are coming from that mental health is staggering. And sadly, suicidal ideation as well among trans kids. So there are different organizations within your state that I highly recommend reaching out to. But those are the main ones that I am aware of nationally as well as, in the States.
Thank you. Thank you. And to our readers, as we close, we want to leave you with this thought. You're living proof of your ancestors' dreams, that they are valid, powerful, and worthy. How will you honor them today? As we walk this journey together, we are planting seeds for those who come after us. Let's root ourselves in hope, healing, and a vision for a better future. Thank you for joining us on Rooted in Our Ancestors' Dreams. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need it. And don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, or follow us on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube. And let's keep the conversation going. Let's lend a hand and let's help in advocating for the rights of LGBTQ individuals. Until next time, stay rooted, stay inspired, and keep dreaming. Thank you so much for joining us, Melissa. This was a great episode and it taught us a lot.
Thank you so much, Cara.
Thank you.